I am Dustin Baker. It is Wednesday, February 28th. We are about a day away from the live on the field action at the NFL Combine. However, we knew this would happen Tuesday. It worked out pretty conveniently. The Vikings leaders took the podium kind of the first in the routine. And if you follow the Vikings as intently as this show does, and you probably do if you watch this show, we were starved for hints and clues because about the only real information we had in the last month was Theo Jackson re-signed, TJ Hawkinson had a surgery finally, and everything else was speculation. That's why there was so much shit out in the open about a Justin Jefferson trade. I swear about 10 media outfits or personalities have floated this Jefferson trade thing. And we're going to talk about it here in the next 15, 20 minutes that Kwesi Adofo-Mensah did his damnedest to dispel that. But I'm here with our Wednesday guest, Josh Fry, who is the boss at Purple PTSD. How are you, my man?
I'm doing good. I'm ready for this week to get through this week and see what other kind of bullshit people can stir up with 40 times and how quarterbacks do on the field. This is a great time if you're just trying to speculate about the NFL draft. So it should be, at least, if nothing else, an entertaining week.
So let's see, let me get this. You like the Combine, but you love the Senior Bowl? Is that how it goes?
Yeah, I think the Combine I think it's important for NFL teams. Don't get me wrong there. I mean, I think the interview process, going through all these medicals and everything, I think that's a really important evaluation process for NFL teams. But I think in terms of what like fans and media actually are able to see, I think the Senior Bowl is way more important than what the guys are going to do on the field in this week, just because they're in pads, they're going up against other players of the same caliber of talent or even a little bit above their caliber of talent that they are usually playing in college. And I just think that that's a little bit more important at the Senior Bowl, the Shrine Bowl, all those other all-star games than what we're going to see this week with prospects running 40 times, catching wide open passes from quarterbacks. So I think it's an important time of the year, but not necessarily in terms of evaluation for media members per se.
What do you make of the Sean McVays and such, where they don't even go? Like, does that cheapen the legitimacy of the event?
I think maybe a little bit. I don't know. I don't really necessarily have much of an opinion on that, but again, it's another, I guess, feather in the cap of the Senior Bowl. Watching that on field is a little bit more important than watching what we're going to see on the field at the Combine. So yeah, I don't necessarily think it's a huge deal. Don't necessarily have a huge opinion on it. But yeah, that's where I stand.
I found it kind of funny yesterday that Kevin O'Connell, I can't remember if it was on KFan or I think it was on KFan. He said that he actually liked to spend more time in his hotel because he actually got work done. Because at the Combine, it's kind of like a big networking ceremony where, like up and comers will pull him aside and say, hey, and O'Connell, I don't know, like he probably was that himself at one point, but I completely agree that sometimes you got to hunker down and do the work.
I mean, you get to those hotel lobbies, that's where all the executives are going to be. That's where you can talk about some upcoming free agency stuff. Hey, what are you going to do this offseason? What are you going to do in the drafts? That sort of stuff. So sort of those off-record conversations can more happen at the hotel bar than it can really happen at the actual Combine event. So I totally get that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I bet you. And you could just tell that it's one of those things where I'm sure he doesn't mind talking to people like that, but when it's one after another and he has to get shit done, it's just like any of our else in our other jobs. If you worked in the, in a brick and mortar building, it's like, oh, you see somebody, you just know that this is going to be 10 minutes that you won't get back and you have other shit to do. I found that funny. He's really relatable. All right. We have topic of today is 5 things that we learned from basically the start of the Combine. So Kwesi Adofo-Mensah's press conference and Kevin O'Connell, which were conveniently back to back. Kevin went first. So you are going to unveil 5 things that you learned, and I will do my best to add some color commentary.
Sounds great to me. And I mean, you want me to just get started with it?
Yeah, you throw out one, and we shall discuss.
Yeah, I mean, just one right off the bat. It's not necessarily something that is out of left field or anything, but just Kwesi continues to keep just about everything completely under the vest in terms of negotiations and just his offseason process. Like he wouldn't get into much in terms of how the actual negotiations are going with Kirk Cousins, Justin Jefferson, Danielle Hunter. Just we're going to have those conversations when it needs to happen, and then talk about those S2 cognitive tests. And just he would never be the guy to release something like what happened with CJ Stroud last year. So yeah, just it really kind of sent home the point that a lot of the stuff that comes out in terms of what's actually going on in Vikings negotiations, it's probably just something that is heard from someone other than Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, and probably about 60% of it probably is just completely false.
Speaking of stuff getting on Kevin O'Connell's nerves, I think you could tell by Kwesi's tone that the noise, as he said, kind of irked him, and he went out of his way to say, especially about Justin Jefferson, that it's false with a big f in the false. And so yeah, and then he pivoted to say that on negotiation matters, he tries out of respect to keep everything in-house so that nothing is leaked. So when you hear all these things, and you would think in a normal offseason, hearing some, hey, maybe they'll trade Jefferson, you'd hear that from one guy on like clutch points or something like that. But it's all over the place. I mean, if you go down the line of every major NFL content machine, ESPN, Bleacher Report, SI.com, at least one has this article about the big what if Jefferson were traded. And did you get that vibe that, at least I think we're going to get into that, but that's part of the thing that irks Kwesi is all of the hearsay out in the open?
Yeah, I mean, I totally get it too. I definitely understand why he wouldn't want that sort of thing to be out there, because it could affect the relationship with him and his player, where the player's reading all these headlines that, oh, maybe I'm getting traded, and I haven't heard that from my GM. What's he saying behind closed doors where I'm not in the room? So I totally get that, and I do think that a lot of that, like you said, is probably completely false, and just I get why I'd be upset about it.
Yeah, there's probably little delineation if you're a player and you see, hey, ESPN top landing spots for Justin Jefferson if he gets traded, you'd probably look at that and be like, I'm not getting traded. And then,
Yeah.
it starts to seep into your mind, like, who leaked this? And I think Kwesi's rebuttal yesterday was to say, like, that's you guys. If you guys are running with that. We're not doing that, but so be it. So, all right, what's the next big thing you learned after Kwesi keeping it tight to the vest?
Yeah, I think he got into a little bit. He was asked a question at one point, and what does age actually matter in terms of evaluating draft prospects? And I think he gave a really interesting answer, where it's kind of this new thing with everybody having all these COVID years and the
Hmm.
transfer portal and everything, having all these extra years of eligibility at the college level. So it's really a brand new thing that they're kind of having to learn on the fly. And I think he really gave a solid answer in terms of, yeah, we evaluate it in a lot of areas on the field. Like if the Vikings were going to draft, say, an edge rusher or a cornerback, they're probably going to look and see, hey, who's younger in this class that is at the top that we can actually get and hold for a couple extra years in terms of their production. But one area where he kind of backed down on that a little bit was that quarterback spot, which
Hmm.
I think is very interesting when you look at some of the top names in this draft, like a Drake May, JJ McCarthy, who are only 21 years old,
Hmm.
compared to maybe, let's say, a Jaden Daniels, who's going to turn, I think, 24 in December. So I think that while the Vikings are keeping tabs on some of the age comparisons with some of these prospects, I think if the Vikings are going to take a quarterback, I don't necessarily believe that they're going to make age a huge factor in that. So I think that was an interesting point that he made.
Yeah, in these last couple drafts, while I vehemently would much prefer a 21-year-old, just because it makes me roll my eyes when I like Hendon Hooker last year. I'm like, really, we're gonna get the guy who's 25? But you kind of have to just accept that some of them will be older. I don't know how long this will last, if it is just blowback from the COVID process. But yeah, Jaden Daniels will be 24 in December. That's kind of about my cutoff. If I see that they're going to be 25 in the rookie season, I'm like, no thanks. We don't really have any of the big ones this year like that. But I swear to God, half of them last year were at least like that when you're like, oh, okay. And I think Bo Nix is another older one. Like he will be 24. But then you have JJ McCarthy, who has engulfed the Vikings social media, who just turned 21, and he's younger than Teddy. And I remember vividly how young Bridgewater felt in his rookie year. But yeah, age certainly applies to how they'll make the decision, and it sounds like it might be more like, hey, we're willing to go older with quarterback out of necessity, and I would hope they wouldn't rule out Jaden Daniels because he's going to be 24. And then you also have my guy Drake May, who's right in the middle, who can do both. So keep that in mind. All right, what's the next thing?
Next thing, I think we should just hop into the Justin Jefferson thing since we brought it up. Basically, just Kwesi vehemently saying that he hasn't considered trading Justin Jefferson, and all the rumors out there are completely false, and he wouldn't say anything about how the actual negotiations are going just because he wanted to respect his player, which I totally understand. But just I think it's time that we stop these Justin Jefferson trade rumors, because I've said it basically since this whole thing started popping up on social media and everything, that the Vikings have been in a competitive rebuild for the past couple of years under adofo-mensah, and trading away Justin Jefferson, I don't think you can really say that they're being competitive or in a rebuild, because you look at a rebuild, they're probably going to look to get younger at the quarterback position. What does a young quarterback need? He needs a star wide receiver that can confidently catch every single pass that he throws his way. And I think Justin Jefferson would do a great job of just taking some of the pressure off of a young quarterback. Meanwhile, if they try to run it back and go for a Super Bowl, you also need one of the best wide receivers in the league, regardless of who the quarterback is. So if it's Kirk Cousins, somebody else. So I've never really thought that this made sense, and I'm really glad to see that Kwesi kind of just shut down a lot of these trade rumors.
Yeah, and I think he did so rather emphatically, because the speech was twofold. We talked about the first part about the noise isn't coming from the Vikings. And then I think it was our guy, Alec Lewis. I say that because he's been on the show. I think he was the one that asked at the end, what about trading Jefferson? And thank God for that question, because it gave adofo-mensah a junior platform to say that has never crossed my mind. And I want to go on a brief little rant here, because I wrote an article on the Vikings territory today that when Kwesi adofo-mensah says it hasn't crossed my mind to even trade Justin Jefferson, the immediate invocation from Vikings fans was, well, Rick Spielman said he wasn't going to trade Spielman, or he was going to trade Percy Harvin, or Stephon Diggs, and look what happened. But real quick, first of all, these are different human beings. Just because Rick Spielman would say, I have no intent on trading Percy Harvin, that doesn't mean that Kwesi adofo-mensah can't be trusted. You're punishing adofo-mensah's nothingness for what Spielman did. And so I don't understand why we would. I understand the paranoia, because it's happened 3 times in the last 25 years for the Vikings, or 20 years for the Vikings. But let's keep in mind, these are different dudes. If Spielman said this yesterday, I'd be like, oh God, we've heard this before. I'd be right there with you. Also, Percy Harvin and Stephon Diggs were damn good wide receivers, but Justin Jefferson is absolutely elite and considered by reasonable folks the best non-quarterback in football. So he'd have to say, you know what, we're not paying this electric dude who's also like a marketing machine. I just don't put Diggs and Harvin in those categories. They were awesome, but they're not Jefferson awesome. Plus, Diggs was disgruntled. Every day he tweeted something new in 2019 and 2020 that hinted either a song lyric or something that said he didn't want to be in the Vikings. Jefferson does nothing of that. Jefferson said his rookie year, I ain't no diva. And so we don't have that disgruntlement. And finally, with Diggs, Kirk Cousins was in his prime as a quarterback, and it really was never an option to get rid of him. So you're paying Cousins then. And now, no matter what happens in the next 2 weeks with Cousins, you're probably going to align the next quarterback's contract, which will be affordable, with Jefferson's almost quarterback money. You couldn't really reasonably keep Diggs and Cousins and the rest of the gang. So it was easy to find a jumping off point with the guy who didn't want to be here in the first place, and that was Diggs. So all of those factors, I think, smack down this lunacy that we had about the Jefferson trade. And I understand that the powers that be see that the feet are dragging on a Jefferson deal. So the media powers that be. So let's figure out where he might go. I understand that, because I do that for a living. but there was never really any realistic basis for it because all sides have said for over a year, this is our guy. We want him for the long haul.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like you said, especially with the Stephon Diggs trade, the Vikings had their quarterback of the future set in place with Kirk Cousins under contract. So by trading Diggs, they had an opportunity to go get another top wide receiver in Justin Jefferson by trading him. And in this scenario, with where the Vikings are currently in, they don't have their quarterback of the future set in place. They don't have a natural path towards taking another wide receiver at the top of this draft class right now. Maybe that changes, but I still think that there shouldn't be really any real fear that a deal with Justin Jefferson isn't going to get done, just because like he is so important to that franchise, and they need him or some other type of wide receiver, top wide receiver in that room to make sure that their quarterback doesn't is facing the least amount of pressure that they possibly can. And I just think that there shouldn't be any real trade rumors at this point with what Kwesi said, the Vikings situation right now, and just everything you've already laid out.
Yeah, if you go back or if you backtrack to 2020 when the Diggs stuff was palpable, the will he be traded? The Vikings were paying Cousins, Harrison Smith, who was ending his prime. Danielle Hunter had a decent deal. Adam Thielen was handsomely paid. Brian O'Neill was about to get paid. And then
Kendricks.
you had, Kendricks and then Diggs. So somebody had to go. Somebody wasn't going to get mucho dinero. And again, because it was Diggs who asked for a trade in 2019 when he just vanished for those 2 days or whatever it was, it always made sense that, all right, well, let's offload the guy who doesn't want to be here. We'll conveniently get a first-round pick. And, thank our lucky stars that they, Zimmer and Spielman, flipped it into Jefferson, because we're able to have conversations like that right now. So, yeah, from these two dudes on this show, Jefferson will not be traded, and we have been consistent about that for forever, because until he diminishes his skill set, which probably isn't like 6 years from now, there's no reason to even dangle him anywhere. And even some of the trade packages are stupid. Well, it feels like the Vikings are getting the short end of the stick on some of the trade packages. So it's so bonkers that we had to go down this in general. Anything else is fair game. Danielle Hunter not playing for the Vikings, Cousins going to play for the Falcons, perfectly reasonable. But trading Jefferson, to me, was only just daydreams by, NFL.com. So.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of Cousins, that's the next one that I wanted to bring up is just it. I feel a little bit more confident after yesterday that the Vikings want to bring Kirk Cousins back next offseason. I think even with like a Danielle Hunter, it seemed like they were more emphatically in favor of bringing Kirk Cousins back than they were with Danielle Hunter. I know Kwesi said that talks are going decently with Hunter and they're having those conversations and everything, but he left it a little bit wishy-washy, at least in my opinion, in terms of if they're going to be able to get a deal done. Because he mentioned we have to take into consideration what's best for the player at this point in their career. And we kind of have to meet in the middle if they're going to be able to make these sorts of deals with a player of that caliber. So Kwesi, he said that he still believes that the Vikings can win with Kirk Cousins as their quarterback. That was one of the big questions going into this offseason based on some things he said in the past was do Vikings actually believe that? And I think after yesterday, we can confidently say that Kwesi still believes that. And KOC again reaffirmed that he wants Kirk Cousins back in a purple uniform next season. So I think that there, in terms of like, if we're going to compare where talks are with Danielle Hunter compared to Kirk Cousins, I think Kirk Cousins is a little bit higher on that totem pole right now.
Yeah, I know what Kwesi communicated yesterday was a reaffirmation to probably fans that free agency is a two-way street. Let's say, for example, Danielle Hunter can get $27 million per year from the Jacksonville Jaguars. We shouldn't look back 2 years from now and say, I can't believe Kwesi let Danielle Hunter walk. I can't believe we saw him walk out the door on his watch. No, this would be a situation where another team was offering more money and the player decided on his own accord, yep, you know what? This is my time for my last big contract. I'm going there. And I think with adofo-mensah on both of these guys, Hunter and Cousins, it's a two-way street. It's not a referendum on whether or not the Vikings want the guy back or can get him back. it's equally as up to the player, just like you and I would have in our job if we had some bidding war for our services. We'd look around and say, well, I love what I'm doing, but hey, this blah 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 site's going to pay me $700,000 per year. I'm going there. It's a no-brainer. So I think free agency is always a two-way street, but we tend to get bogged down in whether or not our team, whether it's the Vikings or some other dude with a Texans podcast, thinking like, well, do they want him back or not? And on Cousins, I left the both speeches by both guys in a similar territory to you. The only caveat I have is Cousins probably has, in my opinion, an offer that's been sitting there for however long. And right now, he keeps saying, well, it's really weird. Free agency doesn't start till March. I think that is him buying himself time between he and, is it Mike McCartney? He and his agent trying to figure out, should we take the $45 million from Atlanta? Just my personal theory. Or go with 38 from the Vikings. And that's a big deal, because millions upon millions. It's whether or not Cousins wants continuity. I think they want Cousins back, the Vikings, but they have a cutoff point. And the only reason there'd be a cutoff point, and I don't know what that is because the guy's going to be 36 and he's got a bad Achilles. So while they could have been more judicious with their words, saying, we do like Kirk, but this is a business, and left it at that. No, they said we want him back. To me, it's just whether or not it's up to Cousins if he wants to take a lower number to stick with his homies in Minnesota, or if he wants to get however extra million per year from the Falcons or the Steelers. Did you get that too?
Yeah, I think we're on the same page with this. I do. The main reason I do think that Kirk Cousins is going to re-sign with the Vikings this offseason. And I do think that a big reason of that is just he's 36 coming off that Achilles. And I'm not necessarily convinced that a team's going to go out there and throw off that $45 to $50 million deal to him. And if that doesn't happen, then I think the Vikings have a really good shot at re-signing him. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. But agreed. If a team like the Falcons is going to throw that money at him, he's probably not going to be in a Minnesota Vikings uniform next season.
Why hasn't the deal happened yet? That's another thing
I guess it's probably he wants to wait until he gets to the open market and just see what, or maybe even just through this week or next week and see what kind of deals that teams are actually going to offer him. Because like you said, it's a business for the players too, where if he's going to be able to get that kind of money, then he's going to go elsewhere. But if he can't, then he's probably just going to come back to Minnesota and run it back with his homies and try to win a Super Bowl there. But I think that's a big reason why I think he's still in that feel out process in the open market and seeing where things actually land in terms of contracts he can get with other teams at this point. So I think that's where it's at.
Do you think that marches us up to March 11th, 12th, or 13th before Cousins' decision? Because legal tampering, a weird term for it, suggests that is when Cousins should be able to start talking with these other teams. Because otherwise I get stuck on Vikings could extend him last week if they wanted to, can't they?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely could. That's kind of the whole thing with his contract right now is I believe it voids at the end of the day on March 12th, and then the legal tampering begins the day before that. So I think we're kind of going to be I think we're going to be pushing up to that limit where he's going to get through that first 24 hours or so of that legal tampering period, and then it might end up being when the ultimate decision is made by both sides where, hey, I want to come back, or you know what, I think I'm going to test my free agency here and see what I can get on the open market.
The good news that I keep coming back to for my own assurances, and I would hope that reasonable fans will feel the same, is no matter what, we're probably going to be feeling good. Because if it's Cousins back, you'll have the vision of beating the 49ers, spanking the Packers. You'll have that vision of that's what it can be. If they say sayonara and Kirk goes to the Falcons or the Steelers, then the only way they can bungle this is by not drafting a quarterback or picking the guy that you don't like, which I think would probably be Bo Nix for the men on this show. No matter what, I think we're going to be duly excited by May 1st, saying, all right, we got Cousins back, plus McCarthy's waiting in the wings. Or, well, Cousins is a Falcon. We traded up for Drake May. I think the path here is something that we're all going to be smiles about. I don't think there's a bad situation unless they say, you know what? Jordan Travis, we're going to develop him. We got Nick Mullins as the bridge or something.
Right. Yeah, that was the one thing I was going to say. If the Vikings go into end this offseason without re-signing Kirk Cousins and also don't draft a quarterback in the first round, I think that is how we don't feel good about this.
Yeah.
But like you said, I mean, if the Vikings re-sign Cousins, then we feel good about it because, I mean, under Kevin O'Connell, the team is 17-8 with Kirk Cousins as their quarterback. Like, that's a really damn good record in the NFL and something that you can really hang your hat on and say, yeah, we can be competitive in this league with these two guys leading the franchise. And it also re-signing Kirk Cousins doesn't mean that they're not going to draft a quarterback either. If you re-sign him to a 1 or 2 year deal, you draft a guy like a Drake May or a JJ McCarthy, even a Jaden Daniels, and develop him for a year or two. Then he can just take over the wings when this next Kirk Cousins deal ends. So yeah, I think this is really a win-win situation unless the Vikings just completely bungle the ball in terms of their quarterback evaluation this spring.
I got to ask you this one thing before we get to the last one. You have one more, right?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, so you saw, was it Adam Schefter tweet today? It was one of those guys, reporter Schefter, that said the Vikings will be meeting with Caleb Williams. Did the Vikings meet with Bryce Young and CJ Stroud last year?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
I don't think they did, because I would have written about that.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that they met with Bryce Young just because at that point it kind of felt like a foregone conclusion that he was going to be the first overall pick. But I can't say for sure whether or not they met with Stroud either. So yeah, that's something I'd have to look back on.
I don't think they did. We'll have to look it up after the show. I should have done my homework, but it just came to mind because if they're talking with the draft's biggest prize per the last 2 years worth of steam, that's more indicative that A, they're willing to move and shake and trade up the board, or B, simply they're doing the diligence on the entire class. Whereas last year they may have thought, well, it's a prayer that we're going to end up trading with the Cardinals for Anthony Richardson. But so yeah, I think that's a tangible clue that if they think that they can realistically get Williams, that's probably why they're meeting with him.
Yeah, the only reason I'd push back on that a little bit is because Williams, in terms of, you look at the draft order right now, the top 11, Vikings sit at 11. The only teams that he didn't meet with in that top 11 are the Arizona Cardinals, Los Angeles Chargers, and Tennessee Titans. They kind of already have their quarterback situations figured out, whereas he met with every single other team on that list. And I do think that just kind of reaffirms that this is going to be a very competitive draft market in terms of teams trying to move up to get a quarterback, or teams potentially, if the deal is right, they might move down for him too. So I do think that is a little bit of a caveat that we have to consider as well. But again, the Vikings they obviously have interest in Williams. If they wouldn't have taken that meeting if they didn't think that they could draft him, or if they didn't think that he was capable of being their quarterback of the future. So yeah, the Vikings are definitely in the mix there.
Yeah, it would have been wild if you would have told us last September that the Vikings were going to be meeting with Caleb Williams at the Combine, because he was such an untouchable first overall pick. You would either think, oh, shit, the Vikings are picking third. They had a terrible season. So it's out there in the stratosphere. All right, what's the final one? And we'll wrap up the show.
Final one was just we got a little bit more confirmation of what the Vikings are looking for in terms of their running back room for next year. That was
huge.
Yeah, they both Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell really seem to like what Ty Chandler did in the second half of the season. They both praised him for his efforts down the stretch, and I think that's definitely valid considering what he was able to do. He was one of the few running backs in that room that actually provided some sort of a semblance of stability over the course of the season. So really good to see there, and I think he's going to have a decent role. But they also left the door open to infusing some more talent into that room in the offseason, whether it be free agency or, like Thor mentioned a couple weeks ago, through the draft. Maybe they get back into that third round and take one of the top guys in this year's class. So there's options on the board, but they do seem to like Ty Chandler a lot. And the one big loser from this seems to be Alexander Mattison, because they both were like, yeah, he did some good things. But then they were like, yeah, Ty Chandler is definitely the guy. So I think that's the big takeaway in terms of their running back room right now is Alexander Madison's probably RB3 in terms of this room next year.
Yeah, here's what they both did when they both were asked about running back. They both said, "Yeah, Ty ... Like that was the first thing out of their mouth. So if they do nothing else, it would be Chandler RB1 week 1 beyond the shadow of a doubt. But this was also an opportunity for both of them, which would have been really easy to say, hey, we got 5 running backs. We're fine. Neither one of them said that. And when you stare at the free agent market, which is probably the most robust ever for running backs, old ones, but robust, and then the draft, which always has good running backs. They don't have a Bijan this year, but they got about 5-6 dudes that you would be palpably excited about if the Vikings drafted them. So in an off season where the Vikings have ranked bottom 6 in back-to-back seasons and running the football per almost every metric, where there are oodles of options, it's lining up for a perfect marriage. And then you have the two teams' leaders saying, yeah, if we want to infuse the room, there are options. It was almost a rubber stamp to me that said the running back room, although deep right now with human bodies, 5 of them, it's going to change. Whether or not that's saying goodbye to Myles Gaskin or Kane Wangu, who might not even have kick returns in general at all. I'm going to guess that when you look at the top of the ticket in August, when we're formulating our teams on the big boards, it's probably going to be Chandler, unknown running back B, and then Madison is our RB3.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I do think it's interesting that I think it was O'Connell hinted at the idea that they've got some young guys in that room and they're interested in seeing what they can do as well. Dwayne McBride comes to mind. I don't know if necessarily he's the answer. Like I think B and Thor have both said on this show that we weren't necessarily high on what he's able to do at the NFL level. But hey, if the Vikings can find a role for him, maybe he's RB4 on that depth chart next year rather than sitting on the practice squad.
Excellent. All right. So this is fried_chicken. That's still your Twitter handle, right?
That is correct. Yep.
All right. That's where you find Josh on Twitter. All of his work is on Purple PTSD. Also his people's work. They run a fabulous website, I can attest. And then next week on Tuesday, Josh and I will chat with the great Paul Charchian, the forefather of fantasy football. And Wednesday, we'll have Ben Lieber, who was on 2 years ago. And he's the one that taught the group that Kellen Mond wasn't going to be any good. And at the time, I didn't listen because I didn't want to believe it. So we'll pick his brain about some scoops and whatnot. Anything else from you, Josh?
No, that's about it. Should be a fun week, and I'm looking forward to chatting next week.
All right, we'll talk to you in 6 days, all right?
Sounds good. See you then.
Later.